Hello, everyone. I am delighted to have everyone here who's able to listen to and share in this conversation that I get to have today with Mo Walrath. Mo, I'm really delighted to have you come and join me today. I know that I host these conversations called Dying to Know More About Death, and do that to uplift the work of Dying Matters Guild, which now both you and I are a part of here in Port Townsend, Washington. And in reading through I'll let you introduce yourself in just a moment, but I know in reading through your written bio, the things that stood out to me as true in what I know of you so far is that you are a fierce student of birth, death, and burial. And I know that I've already shared with you that birth and death overlap with you and I, and that the funeral part, the post-death part, is something that you get to teach me about because it's a part of that whole process that I'm not as familiar with. And the other thing that stood out as so true to me in my knowing of you so far is that you're a reverent farmer and threshold worker, and that you are both fierce and fierce and just so gentle in your spirit. So with that, I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your weaving of these amazing caskets and funeral vessels.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, yeah, where to start? I think I guess, yeah, first and foremost, I do consider myself a weaver and like a kind of a student for forever. especially in the realms of birth and death and burial. Those are kind of my like foundational sort of starting points, and then I sort of branch off of each of those, at least right now in my life. I mean, so yeah, I'm a weaver, and like I say in the bio too, I'm at this point very devoted to willow and weaving and tending the living tradition of weaving, and then allowing that practice and dedication and devotion to show up in more emergent ways when it comes to community death care. And so over the years, through the weaving work and through creating these vessels, which I call caskets or woven coffins or threshold vessels or portals for future imagining, or tombs for the living, but really they're doorways for dialogue and conversation. I've kept repeating that over and over again, because as a doorway, they open up possibilities for building relationship, whether it be with someone, an individual, and their choices around, what do I say, like around consumption and creation and decomposition, and their choices around death and dying. So on an individual level or a community at large, like seeing one of these vessels and it being a doorway for community education, or
Right.
or noticing where the gaps might be in terms of how we're held when we die. And
Right.
and in a lot of cases, what inspired me to come to both birth and death work is really like how we're not held, and like where the gaps continue to be. And I find like those gaps or like chasms to be really creative and fertile places for sort of like never before seen possibilities
Right.
of being a human, and either reclaiming traditions around death and dying or rituals, which vary across cultures. So
Yeah.
there's like that reclamation, or just like I say with the coffins, I see them, they're rooted in tradition, but it's a living tradition. And so I when I create them, they're vessels for right now. They're woven responses. That's how I put it. They're
Right.
responses to the deep needs that I see in humanity in the living world. Um and to
Well,
just yeah.
one thing I'm fascinated with, I know that because I'm older and have gray hair and more aware that I have less time ahead, no matter how you look at it, I have less time ahead than I do behind. It was really amazing to me as we initiated this guild that there was a response and an interest in death with those people who don't have gray hair yet. That there were so many wonderful young women and men who were interested in dying. When dying is continues to be still at this part, it's just so removed as a part of our conversation in the human experience. uh, I was a birth educator years ago, did more of the birth doula work. And at that point, our focus was expanding the conversation about birth. How do you remember that birth is a human experience, not a medical experience? And how can you reclaim the sacredness of that experience? And then to meet you, who so young and about ready to give birth yourself, be aware and have a kind of a conscious sacred attention toward the end days, to be aware of that circle. So what led you in your weaving, in your life so far, what led you to this conversation about death and dying, and including the burial focus
Mhm. Yeah.
in your work?
Well, I mean, a part of it, and this is more, that's, it's more of the sort of the fierce part, is that with birth and death, I was looking at where do we hand things over to other people that really are innate and really are a part of, so much a part of just being a human, and allow us to feel like we have purpose and meaning in our lives. And
Yeah.
to me, um, integrating how we care for or hold knowledge, or simply like tend to the living and the dying in our lives, like gives us purpose, it gives us
Right.
meaning. And that's to me, like I think that is um something that I continue to look at the ways that um those practices or those traditions have been handed off to either like the state or the government, or
Right.
even doulas or midwives, or these, or educators, like all of these titles, which I haven't had the title of midwife, but I've played around with. And really what I come back to is like, I just want to learn these, what they are, like skills, or remember these things so that they're ready when they're called on by
Right.
my
Right.
community or by my family. And so with tied into all of that, in terms of how I started gravitating towards these conversations or this work, um, especially like around burial and the baskets, um, is that, I mean, let's see if I could describe this. Um, we're in a continuous cycle of life and death, and I really see death as a companion. And so in the smallest ways, acknowledging life and acknowledging death every day. And so that could be the meal that I have on my table, you know, when I sit down and like light a candle and acknowledge the life that's there in the bowls, plant and animal life. And that goes into the sort of growing, not the sort of growing and gathering of the food that I eat, raising animals and being a part of their life and a part of their death and a part of the reverent,
Yeah.
the reverent tending to their life and their death. And so seeing that ongoing cycle and relationship of life and death as companions, you know, that's in the willow work and the weaving work, and like in this darker time of the year in the winters when I'm harvesting the willow. And so there's a whole timing and rhythm to the baskets in terms of being in relationship with having a different relationship to time, essentially.
Yeah.
And reclaiming for myself a relationship to time that feels like, and I talk about this a lot, like outside of the sort of capitalist and productive approach to time and our bodies and what we create, and then how it gets, you know, consumed in the world. And then with burial, like it was a natural thing for me because to get into, I started weaving the coffins, and then I started forming relationships with different conservation burial grounds around the country, and found some really amazing teachers and mentors, and continue to have a critical lens on what does conservation mean, and to me, like, how is that in some ways just perpetuating the same sort of mentality, or like sort of colonial mentality around a relationship with the land. And so I just, you know, and learning about, let's just say like restoration work and ecological restoration work, and seeing human beings as a part of the ecology rather than this large continuum of conservation, don't touch humans, and or totally clear cut and exploit humans, you know, finding where can we be in the middle where we can fully participate in those cycles of life and death, and like tend thriving life, and also like be stewards of death and decomposition. And so that's that's where the burial.
Yeah. Can you share with our listeners what you know about what the options, the burial options are that we have, and how, you know, in our culture, like you were saying, people get to a point where they move so fast that they lose sight of the natural rhythm of life. And in my experience of listening to you talk about your willow coffins, just that being that threshold worker, that holding the space, that coffins, woven coffins, or any container does, it holds the space. And the whole concept of the willow weaving is weaving together all of the facets of that person's life. I mean, you take it to a reverence place, but if you can talk a little bit about what you know about what our burial options are and why your work is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the biggest part of, or the part that of my work that I want to continue to lead with, is just meeting people where they're at. And so and inspiring to empower, rather than say this is, you know, this is the way it should be done, or this is the way that's best for the earth, or best for, like, I don't, I really strive never to come from that place, which is hard sometimes when you're really passionate about something, but
I know.
So in terms of burial, I mean, locally right now, I mentioned the conservation burial grounds. And so conservation burial I see as a sort of branch of like green burial, in terms of cemetery land that's licensed as cemetery land, can then be certified as a green burial ground, but also a conservation burial ground. And so what that means is that a percentage of the land that's zoned as cemetery is also zoned as conservation land. So meaning that it can never be developed, and that there's certain practices around how humans are participating with that ecosystem. Things like building materials and harvesting and clearing or not clearing, and like a whole sort of set of practices. And it also includes things like burial density. And so I think for the standard for conservation burial is 100 burials per acre, which when I think about that, it actually feels pretty dense. And my
Right.
approach to any of that is like, well, the land is really what determines the density,
Right.
instead of the sort of, you can grid the landscape out, but ultimately when you're out there with the land and standing there, that's what's going to determine where the burial happens. And so
many listeners may not even understand
right.
what a how conversation and burial, the Venn diagram, how they overlap.
Yeah.
And like traditional burial long ago was formaldehyde and embalming and that whole route. And how have we evolved to even now having choices about green burial and what that actually is?
Yeah. So, I mean, with conservation burial, like I said, it's kind of a branch of green burial. And what that means is that there's certain standards of within the practice of green burial. So, in more sort of traditional cemeteries, and I would say maybe like this is speaking within the past like 150 years or something, there's been this tradition where oftentimes it's required for burial that the graves are dug at 6 feet. There's a necessary concrete liner. Your coffins there has to be a liner that may or may not be biodegradable. It's acceptable to put coffins with steel and other chemicals that the wood could be treated with into the earth. Sometimes they've been completely sealed over with cement. So we're like encased in the earth rather than we could think kind of like return to the earth, where roots and the microbial life is able to have much easier access to the body for decomposition. And so I can just do a quick comparison. So I gave the approximate like 6 feet and concrete burial versus a within green burial and conservation burial, it's a shallow grave. So that's like 3 feet deep. And that's deep enough for like a smell barrier for creatures, and also a really great depth for the soil biology and the life in the subterranean world to work its magic.
Right.
And so that's a distinction. So you mentioned embalming, which my knowledge of embalming is that embalming is one of the sort of byproducts of war and of bodies being able to be preserved for a certain amount of time so that they could make them back to the dead bodies can make them their way back to their home, their families.
Right.
And then it's just become a ritual or a tradition within funerary practices to keep that practice going, right? So the use of chemicals to preserve the body.
Well, and I think too, a fear of death has prolonged that
Yeah.
custom. And um, yeah, so I think most people don't even question it. It becomes a routine that we
Yeah.
follow.
And I think that that's where I'm really, that's where I like to meet people where they're at, where it could be a routine, but it could also be something at this point that's meaningful for a family or a community. And so, um, like I said, I don't ever want to project this is the right way to do things. It's more just, okay, well, the reality is that if we have those chemicals in our body, more than we already do as living humans, um, and if burial is chosen, like then um, those chemicals are going to leach into the earth,
Right.
and what does that mean? And just being able to start to unravel and illuminate what that means
Yeah.
while we're alive, so that we can make informed choices
Right.
um, around how what happens to our bodies after we die. And um, so yeah, there's in terms of burial, the conservation burial or the green burial, and certain cemeteries that are more traditional cemeteries that have the vaults that
Yeah.
allow for embalming, that are super manicured and things like this, have also they can integrate green burial into those sites as well. And
And do you
so,
feel it's leaning in that direction more and more? Or do you
I
think
mean,
there's still great resistance to that?
it's hard to say because I feel like I have a particular lens on the world, and so it's like what I see all the time is more options around that.
Yeah.
There being more options and more of a leaning towards like, yes, let's provide this for our community, um, and I think that ultimately it's slow, like real,
Right.
um, change is slow, and I think that's important, that we do take our time, because we can say that, oh, green burial is the option, and green burial, but there could be something, and this is really what I feel, and I think that it's very much rooted within a local context, within each community and several communities within that community, they're going to have different needs around what burial options feel like
Right.
they're relevant or make sense or are accessible.
Or
And
then, like you say, just meeting people where they are so that they can even become aware that there are options other than the ones they've always
yeah,
gone to.
yeah. And I mean, in some cases, that's where I feel like language is really important. And I do feel that sometimes the conversations around the more quote like natural options for burial aren't accessible to the people that they really need to be accessible to, in terms of, um, like I said, like the gaps around how we're held in our death and dying, and how the systems that we're living within um, don't really support informed or empowered choices. And so I think that that's what I would like to see. And ultimately, I would really love, I say, okay, well, maybe by the time that I die within the community that I'm in, that I won't ultimately need to be making all the choices, that there will be enough of a culture around death and dying, that some of those choices will be held by the surrounding my surrounding community in a way that they're not held right now. Like I still feel like some of the ways that we're approaching any form of body disposition, what happens to our bodies after we die, like, is so hyper individualized, which to me is just an echo of one of the symptoms of capitalism. And so I just, yeah, that's kind of my prayer for this work, is that within these sort of localized movements around death care, community death care, that that there just starts to be more of a web and a net that can catch people, and where it's not so individual,
Right.
and
Right. And
um,
and commercialized so
yeah.
that people recognize that all people have choices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing your vision, of your lifetime arc, and just the evolutionary journey that we're on, about bringing the conversation about death back into our daily living experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really value that death isn't this taboo topic that's horrible. It's part of the paradox that reminds us to live fully present now. Um, so I'm really, really grateful for everything that you've shared. And is there a way that listeners can reach you, or if they're interested in learning more about your funeral vessels and the work that you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say just my website is great. It's just called Woven Thresholds.
Great. Woventhresholds.com.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Mo, thank you very much for your time today. And
Yeah, I hope I answered your questions. I meander quite a bit.
yeah. Well, I think, meandering is really a valuable thing about it, because we consider things that we might not have
Mm-hmm.
thought of before. So I appreciate your work. I appreciate the gift that you bring to Dying Matters Guild. And I'm grateful that you bring your youthful vision to add to the stew.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.